to the read. Well, how to read what China is really up to, because too many people for 40 years now have totally misread the threat. There is a document to read. It came out last week. Now, as I said earlier, last week, Chinese dictator Xi Jinping had Russian President Vladimir Putin. He came as his guest of honour to the Beijing Olympics. And the two men signed this joint statement, which is kind of pact for dictators and authoritarians and killers and thieves. Everyone should read it, just like everyone should have read Hitler's Mein Kampf before World War II to figure out what he was really up to, because he said it right there. Joining me to discuss this, and an equally disturbing book from President Biden's top advisor on China, is John Roskam, head of the Institute of Public Affairs. John Roskam, thanks for your time. And listen, that joint statement by President Xi Jinping and President Putin of Russia, China and Russia signing it together, it's had so little attention. Even though it's so frightening, it declares a new world order, says America's on the slide, says they're in a pact against democracy movements, they're against countries criticising human rights in other countries, and they're going to support each other in their threatened wars. Russia against Ukraine, China against Taiwan. What did you make of this document?
Well, I think, Andrew, exactly as you said, there's been very little attention paid to it because we've been so focused on tweets from ministers in Canberra. But it's, as you say, it outlines a new world order. And for Australians, it's alarming because it talks about how Russia and China are democracies. Now, to anyone familiar with what we understand to be democracy, that's not a term we associate with Russia and China. But they say democracy is what we define it to be. And what's interesting about this statement from Russia and China last week is that it coincides with the release of a book at the end of last year by an American analyst, Rush Doshi, that everyone is talking about in Washington and now in Canberra, called The Long Game. And it outlines how over 40 years, the Chinese Communist Party, as a Marxist-Leninist party, has charted a course of first blunting Western power, then building its own power, and ultimately, as the US Secretary of State has said today in Canberra, seeking domination over large parts of the Asia-Pacific region and ultimately the globe.
Yes, there's only one good thing about this book that you mentioned, The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order, and that is that the author, Rush Doshi, is actually Joe Biden's point man, his top advisor on China. So we know that someone there knows exactly what's going on. What's so unique about this book is it goes through 40 years of documentation, official Chinese statements, resolutions from the top leaders, and says, guys, they've been playing us. And he traces it beautifully all the way through. The idea that Xi Jinping has suddenly gone rogue and get rid of him and China will be good again, forget it. This has been on the cards, what China's doing now, since Deng Xiaoping, Deng, when he was supreme leader. Now, what Deng said at the time was, you know, we're too weak, hide our capabilities, bide our time. But then when the global financial crisis happened in 2008, suddenly China said, this is our chance, we can go for it. And Xi Jinping has just put his the accelerator flat to the floor.
And the other thing that's interesting for so many of us in the West is we had worked on the assumption that I and others believed in, that with free markets, with capitalism comes democracy, the gradual liberalisation of authoritarian regimes. What's frightening about this book, and as you said, this fellow, Rush Doshi, is a Democrat. He's no Trump supporter. He outlines how that has never been part of the understanding of the Chinese Communist Party. He explains how, as you said, at the end of the Berlin Wall, with the rise of America, China needed to reconceive of its place in the world. And he talks about how we've been willing to do business in China. We've been willing to invest in China. We've brought China into the liberal world order to not much good. And his challenge is that the United States and other countries in the West need to move their priorities from the Middle East, where we've been focused for so long, to the rising power and the ambitions of China, which we have not sought to understood until very, very, very recently.
Absolutely. I urge every politician in Canberra to read this book, because we've been asleep at the wheel to the point where China actually bought, via someone else, Australia's last aircraft carrier to help understand it, to build its own. It's now got a third one, a super aircraft carrier, on the way this year. That's it from me, John Roskam. Thank you so much for your time.